And that's a unique view and worth listening to. But now we're going to have Tristan and Sarah. You're going to be together?
He's going to go.
Oh, right, just Tristan. So this actually is also very interesting. It's about software and about startups and about, you know, aggregating a lot of interesting things into one place and making that work. So please welcome Tristan Shannon.
Thanks, mate. Full Profiles started in October last year by the former founders of the Clear Grain Exchange and Ag Farm. And Full Profile is focused on solving inefficiencies in the supply chain and trying to de-risk commodity transactions. We believe the technology that's going to have the biggest impact on agriculture over the next 10 years has arrived. And you'll be surprised to learn that it's not all your common ones we hear about, like big data and drones or IoT or even autonomous vehicles. The technology we believe is going to have the biggest impact on agriculture is actually a technology called blockchain. So when we think about a traditional transaction between a buyer and a seller, essentially they reach an agreement, the seller hands over the product or the goods. Sometime later, generally in ag or traditionally in ag, that's been loosely 30 days later, the buyer will actually instigate a payment. The banks will then process this payment, which again is generally an overnight process. And finally, something 30 days later, the seller will receive their money. So the problem with this transaction is that the exchange of goods or the asset and the exchange of money are two separate things. The problem with this transaction is that the seller's placing complete trust in the buyer that they're going to firstly make the payment, they're going to make the payment on time, and they're going to make the payment for the correct amount. And the problem with the transaction is that even once the payment is instigated by the buyer, it still takes time to move through our traditional banking systems. And if you want to get guaranteed same-day payment through banking systems, it costs about $20 for that actual transaction. Imagine if you could actually combine the exchange of the goods or the asset and the payment into one transaction where they're basically simultaneously exchanged in real time. Blockchain will enable this. A blockchain records all the transactions that happen for an asset in what can be considered an asset store or a ledger. This ledger is shared across multiple locations. With each time a transaction occurs, the ledger is verified by the parties shared on that ledger. As more transactions occur to the asset, each one is chained on to the previous and subsequent transactions around that asset, which therefore forms an immutable historical record for that asset, a single source of truth, if you like, documenting all the historical transactions that have occurred with that asset. So what does all that mean for ag? It's quite a cool technology, but yeah, how are we going to apply it to our industry? And this is something Full Profile's been working exclusively on for the last 12 months. And we'd like to run through today just two simple use cases where the first we want to look at how blockchain can enable secure settlements, and secondly, how blockchain can enable provenance throughout the supply chain. So when we think about a grain transaction today, essentially it's a traditional sort of trust model where the grower will deliver their grain and then say 30 days later they agree that the buyer will make a payment to them. However, in that time we know that the grain is commingled with other growers' grain, it might be on-sold to another buyer, it could be processed, or it could even be exported by the time the grower actually comes to receiving their payment. So in the event that the buyer doesn't pay, essentially there's basically no chance the grower can actually just go and get his asset in the grain back. In 2014 alone, this was estimated to cost the Australian grain growers about $60 million in default payments. And the VFF estimated that this had a knock-on effect to local communities of 2.5 times this amount. So non-payment in just this one sector of grain alone is a serious issue. So imagine in a blockchain environment, this transaction could occur along the lines of where the truck would arrive at the silo, They would go on to capture the gross weight and the quality. The blockchain could then estimate a load value for what this truckload of grain is worth. And then in real time, the blockchain could actually verify that that buyer has sufficient funds in their account to actually make this payment of this amount of grain. Which would then mean when the truck's actually sitting between the sample stand and the unloading hopper, they could actually receive a notification to say that this buyer has sufficient funds to actually make that payment to them. In the event that the buyer does have sufficient funds, they proceed to unload the grain, they capture the final weights, and then that calculates a final load value for the grain. Then in real time, the blockchain will simultaneously exchange the asset, in this case the grain, for the funds. And essentially that completely de-risks the process in that it's completely secure, in that the grower hasn't lost his grain before the payment's actually been made. This is what blockchain can enable. This is a huge advancement in where we are today in our traditional commodity transactions, in that when you think about the traditional trust model where they're getting paid, say 30 days later, what we've achieved here via a blockchain transaction is the grower's actually being paid, and by paid we mean the money's actually in his account before he's even left the silo. So it's a huge leap forward based on this new technology and what it can enable for secure payments around agriculture. If we have a look at the second use case of provenance, and in this case we'll have a look at a basic supply chain in livestock. Essentially, there'll be a cow in a paddock, it might get on-sold to a feedlot, goes through an abattoir, onto the processor, retail outlet, and finally ends up on someone's plate. The problem with this traditional supply chain is that each party who interacts with the asset, in this case beef or cattle, they actually form their own version of what that asset is. So in the case of the farmer, he might upload that cow's tag number into his farm management software. The feedlot might have scanned the NLIS tag and put it into whatever software they're using. The abattoir might have a carcass barcode they've uploaded into their software. And so it goes through the supply chain, which creates the problem that as a consumer with that food on your plate, it's actually impossible to go back through everyone's private database to firstly identify which asset you're actually consuming, and then how does that asset link to the previous person along the supply chain. What blockchain could enable is every time there's a transaction along that supply chain, it actually links the previous and the subsequent transactions to that asset. So we've actually now got one asset moving along the supply chain instead of just creating new versions of the asset every time it transacts. So this again is what blockchain will enable for agricultural in provenance space. Coupled with this will be, every time that animal does move and transacts, will be the secure payment piece. So we're de-risking the transactions as well as achieving provenance. And we think this is really important in that provenance has traditionally been that thing that everyone wants but no one really wants to pay for. So by coupling it with the transactions, which the industry wants because people do want to de-risk transactions, we believe we can actually achieve provenance at a very low cost base and achieve this no matter what size scale you're on as a farmer or how much investment you've made in the supply chain. It'll basically be all inclusive of everyone involved in that supply chain. Blockchain is closer than you might think. In fact, a few months ago, we were involved in a Westpac blockchain hackathon, which we went on to win, and that led us to become the first Australian AgTech company to actually pitch this concept at a famous financial tech conference in New York called Finovate. The financial tech industry is actually getting incredibly excited by this new technology. And Full Profile has been working quite hard to actually ensure that we can take all those gains of this blockchain technology and apply it to agriculture. So this harvest, we're actually launching a product called AgriDigital, which we're going to initially start in the Australian grains industry and run a pilot with Fletcher's International at Dubbo, where we'll be looking to actually simulate providing these secure payments on a blockchain via grain deliveries and then also build this out to include the provenance piece. So you can jump on our website and there's a heap of blogs around what this blockchain is, how it's might apply to agriculture, as well as sign up to our newsletter. And this is probably the first time you've heard of this technology called blockchain, but I assure you it's not going to be the last. This is an incredibly exciting new technology for our industry, and it's something that's coming pretty rapidly at the moment. Thank you.
Oh, that was interesting. And Xavier mentioned that there are 4 companies that control 75% of the agricultural trading in the world at the moment. Does that looks like that's going to really break that down? It's sort of, is it going to be a many-to-many type arrangement, or is it?
Absolutely. So it's, the concept of blockchain is it's all inclusive. So it doesn't sort of matter, it will no longer matter how big a company you are or what your risk assessment is. So everyone can compete on a level playing field. So it should open up competition like holistically and completely.
Wow, that's a big step forward. That's fascinating. Okay, thank you for that. That was serious.